Today we're having a look at the new Sirui Vision Prime 1 lens kit here. These lenses are pretty special, but to be honest, I would usually never use such lenses. Why? Because they don't have autofocus, and that's a deal breaker for most of what I do. But something happened while I was testing them that made me rethink my setup a bit, at least for A-roll shots like this one here. And now I actually use one of them all the time. Let me explain. Now, these lenses are quite special because they come with 4 interchangeable lens mounts for Sony E mount, which is attached right now, Panasonic L, Canon RF, and Nikon Z mount, and at a very good price at $1,599 for the whole kit of 3 lenses, or $550 per lens during launch. But of course, when I first got these lenses, I honestly didn't know what to do with them because I'm so used to autofocus lenses. And while I do constantly switch between auto and manual focus to ensure the focus stays where it is, I rarely shoot manual focus exclusively. But just out of curiosity, I decided to try the 24mm 1.4 lens for the A-roll in my recent iPad Pro M4 video, because I wanted to have a 24mm 1.4 lens anyway, just for the look. And of course, I thought about getting an autofocus lens for that before. So I wasn't expecting much, but it was surprisingly easy to stay in the in-focus area when I shot the talking head. And when I looked at the footage later, I was amazed by how good and kind of creamy it looked. Like, I even showed it to a friend and he also absolutely loved it. So for my next video, the one about craft dogs, I used the same lens again for the talking head part, just because it looks so much better than using my 16-35 2.8 G Master at 24mm. But then I started wondering, is it just the f1.4 aperture making everything look so good, or is it something about the lens itself? Now, I don't have a 24mm 1.4 autofocus lens for comparison, so I used the Sirui 35mm 1.4 instead and compared it to my Sony 35mm f1.4 G Master lens. And here's what I found. Right away, I noticed that the Sirui Vision Prime lens looks slightly warmer and less purple compared to the Sony 35mm G Master. What I honestly like warmer tones generally look a bit better, especially when they come straight out of camera. But what I noticed even more was that the footage from the Sirui Vision Prime lens feels a bit smoother, what gives them a really nice soft look. And that's the same thing I noticed with the 24mm f1.4 when I used it for A-roll. The Sirui lenses generally seem to have a softer, more creamy and organic look, while the Sony G Master lens feels more digital. Like the gradations on my skin, for example, is a part where it really becomes noticeable. Both lenses look good, but I do prefer the Sirui for my home setup. It just feels more natural and less clinical. So that's why I'm actually interested in these lenses now, at least for when I shoot at home or generally in controlled environments where manual focus isn't a big deal. So let me change the lens now from my 16-35 2.8 to the Sirui 24mm 1.4 so that you can see the difference. Okay, we're on the Sirui 24mm now. Looks so much better, right? Now, the look of those lenses could actually be imperfections, because imperfections ironically can oftentimes make an image perfect. So I would say let's take a closer look at the lenses themselves, starting with sharpness. Sirui states on their website that these lenses can out-resolve 8K resolution, so they should be super sharp, but I could only test them on an A7C Mark II at 33 megapixel resolution, because I don't have an A7 R5 here or so around 7K is what I've been testing them at. And at this resolution, the 24mm is already pretty sharp in the center at f1.4. It gets even sharper at f2.8, but stays pretty consistent from there. The edges are a bit softer wide open and never become perfectly sharp, but they do improve noticeably by f4. There's also very mild purple fringing around the edges, but it's only noticeable if you crop in to about 400%, so that's a very good performance. On the 35mm, I noticed that it's slightly softer than the G Master at f1.4, but by f2.8 they are almost identical in sharpness. The edges are softer at f1.4 and become sharpest around f8, though even then they are not perfectly sharp. There's also a bit of mild purple fringing around the edges, but definitely on the lower side again, nothing to worry about. The 50mm is quite sharp in the center at f1.4, but also a bit below the 35mm G Master lens and also gets sharper towards f2.8. The edges are softer at f1.4 but get much better around f5.6, though as well not perfectly sharp. And this lens also shows some fringing at the edges, not a lot but a bit more as on the others, and it stays there across the whole aperture range. When it comes to Loka, the 24mm doesn't show any noticeable longitudinal chromatic aberrations. Very nice to see that. The 35mm has slight blue fringing in the foreground and warm tones in the background, which clean up by f2.8, but you only notice that when you crop in by at least 2x, where it's still pretty mild, so that's also pretty good performance. And the 50mm is more noticeable with reddish tones in the front and blue-green fringing in the back. It's quite apparent compared to the other two lenses, but it also requires zooming in to become noticeable and improves by f2.8. Vignetting is also something to look at, especially if you shoot wide open. Now, I tested vignetting in a 3:2 aspect ratio, shooting raw photos, so if you're shooting in 16:9 or wider, you will notice less of that, just as a little disclaimer here. And the 24mm shows noticeable vignetting at f1.4, but it reduces quite a bit by f2.8. Some vignetting is always there though. The 35mm also has strong vignetting at f1.4, but it gets much better by f2.8 and still remains slightly visible across the aperture range. And the 50mm looks a bit better wide open compared to the others, but it also shows some vignetting that improves around f2.8. Next up is the Booker, which is also quite similar on all three lenses. The Booker balls on the 35mm do have some cat's eye shape towards the edges, while that is less pronounced on the 24 and 50mm. Some of the Booker balls also show a slight onion ring-like texture, but it's rather mild, nothing that jumps straight into your eyes. And aside from that, the Booker is actually really nice and soft, pleasing to look at, and you get a lot of it thanks to f1.4. And when it comes to flaring, I was pretty surprised because these lenses show some of the lowest amount of flaring of all lenses I've ever used. The 24mm barely shows any flaring at all, and on the 35 and 50mm there is a slight, very soft flare around the middle, but very hard to see and certainly not distracting. So in my opinion, they could even have more flaring because I love lens flares. However, maybe that's also a good thing, because they probably use excellent coating, what could be one reason for the overall nice look of those lenses. And some of you might also prefer not having much flaring, so in that case you definitely might want to have a look at these lenses. A worry you might have at f1.4 is focus breathing. That is an issue for many lenses, but not the Sirui Vision Primes. The 24mm has a tiny bit of breathing, but it's so low that you would never notice it in actual video footage. The 35mm shows no noticeable focus breathing to me at all, and the 50mm does breathe a tiny bit more than the 24mm, but it's still barely noticeable in real world shooting conditions. So optically overall, they might be a tiny bit behind G Masters under lab testing conditions aside from focus breathing, if you call my studio a lab, but considering that under real life shooting scenarios they actually look slightly better in my opinion, that might actually be neglectable, especially considering that you still get pretty sharp footage without heavy chromatic aberrations or so. However, let's talk about the bodies of those lenses, because that is actually what sets them apart. As you might have noticed already, these lenses come in a super nice hardshell box where everything is nicely sorted, and the bodies feel really premium because they are made of all metal construction, yet they are still relatively light at around 600 grams, and as the weight of those lenses is within a 12-gram difference, they are great for gimbal work, so you don't have to recalibrate it all the time. Both the focus and aperture wheels are super smooth, and as expected for Cine lenses, the aperture dial is not clickable, which you might prefer for smooth exposure control, but I wish we would have control over that to avoid changing the aperture accidentally. Anyway, the most impressive feature is that the mounts are interchangeable between Sony, Panasonic, Nikon and Canon as mentioned in the beginning. And here's the cool part, all the adapters come with the lenses and even the tool to switch the mount is included. Great is also that Sirui made the mount swapping process pretty much foolproof, what means that the lenses come with a cross screwdriver and only the screws you're supposed to unscrew are cross type. But well, it turns out I'm an ultra fool. I thought Sirui put the wrong screwdriver in the box because the screws I saw first are Torx. So I used my own screwdriver, ended up unscrewing the outer screws. So I accidentally took the whole mount apart, broke a screw while reassembling it and also reassembled it wrong. And now my lens mounts on the camera 90 degrees off. So lesson learned, better read the manual or watch tutorial before you start screwing around. I've been a carpenter before, I should know better. So don't make the same mistake, only use the screwdriver the lenses come with and you can only do it right. And it's actually super easy and only takes about 2 minutes to change the mounts. So what's the verdict? For me, the interchangeable mounts are a huge plus because I'm planning to get a Panasonic S5 Mark II as my stationary camera for the A-roll setup here. So it looks like I've already found my lens for that. I've also realized that I don't need autofocus for A-roll unless I'm holding a product up to the camera or so. But for that, I've got an overhead rig now, which looks nicer anyway. Aside from that, the focus breathing test really showed me why filmmakers love Cine lenses. For strong focus pulls, they definitely look better. I have to say, Sony does have focus breathing correction built in, which works really well, but crops the image a bit. So I would say that's still the better solution for solo filmmakers at least, because it's just one thing less you have to worry about, so you can focus more on capturing your story. For travel filmmaking or general content creation that I often do, they are certainly not the best choice just because of the lack of autofocus. But for filmmakers who don't rely on autofocus or use LiDAR systems like the DJI one, these lenses are actually a fantastic budget-friendly option, especially if you haven't settled on a camera system yet, or if you work with multiple camera systems for different clients and want to achieve a more consistent look. So it's always about the question who a certain tool is made for and not if it's the best for everyone. But there is a truly special lens from Sirui that caters to more people, the Sirui 40mm f1.8 anamorphic autofocus lens, which I reviewed recently in this video here in the corner. It's travel friendly and definitely makes your videos stand out, so check it out and I see you there.